Well, today we're going to be building the Ghazghkull Thraka model. As you can see, he's a very complex model, lots of stuff going on, lots of different little pieces. Take the model out, of course, you always start with your little bases for each of your models, a bunch of sprues containing each of the different parts, all individually separated into little pieces that are marked with numbers so you know in which order to assemble them. So inside our instruction manual here, you have a step-by-step guide of how to assemble the miniature. One thing to note is often they'll have it as if you should just assemble the whole thing and then paint it. Some people do that. For a model that's this complicated, I tend to actually build it in phases, and we'll go into that a little bit later. And of course, if you're looking for a little inspiration, they always have fully painted pictures in the back, as well as all the stats for the unit. So in addition to all the different pieces all laid out in different steps, they also have usually a couple different variations of the model. So, as you can see, they'll go step by step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you'll just follow those numbers on the sprue, as shown here. It's kind of hard to see sometimes, so just double check before you start cutting stuff out. But follow that, and you'll be able to assemble it just as shown. So use your handy little side cutters here. You can remove each and every piece, one by one, and then start filing them down and preparing them to be assembled. Patience is a virtue. Lots and lots and lots of cutting. And sometimes bits break off, but that's okay. We'll just pretend that was never there, and it'll all be okay. So as I was saying before, each of the model pieces has a number right next to it on the sprue that lets you know which number it is. So the initial instruction was telling us to cut out leg piece number 1, so that's what I'm doing here. That way we can assemble it with the rest of them and get things moving. So another thing you want to do to prep the models, make sure you go ahead and scrape off all the flashing lines as well as the little bits of the sprue that might be still on it and any other inconsistencies that might stand out when you go to paint it. Now once everything's cut out, you've got everything sanded down and ready to go, very carefully apply a very tiny amount of super glue to the model in as many of the contacting faces as you can, and then go ahead and grab your other piece. Make sure they're going to fit right, and press them together. And you'll probably end up getting a little bit of super glue on yourself. Once or twice. It comes off eventually. And we'll continue step by step until this entire section of the model is complete and fully glued together. So now that we have the two bits of this particular section of the model put together, what I want to kind of show is that some people, like I said, do like to paint it when it's all together, but as you can see here, as we put this on top, we're actually going to get a few spots where it'll be really hard to reach things, especially the underside of that little cloth hanging down. It'll be very difficult to reach that later, especially with how the model is stanced on the platform. Instead, what I'm going to do is separate that out to make sure that it has adequate room to be painted separately and then put back together later. So once you've gone through and assembled everything, like I said, trying to be conscious of about what may or may not be easy to put together later, you'll go ahead and want to separate everything out into its individual pieces to prep it for paint. So we're going to be doing a little bit of priming to it with a spray can to get everything nice and ready to start applying our color paint. You can go ahead and take your parts and arrange them in there. I try to keep them somewhat grouped together by their pieces, so that way when I go to assemble them later, it's easier, but feel free to just chuck them in there.
You know, like a normal person would, because not everyone's type A.
It's very true. This order does not say very well. So when you go to spray paint these, go ahead and make sure that you have a fairly well ventilated area, or are at the very least wearing a respirator. In this case, I'm painting them in my garage, so I have plenty of ventilation available. So the main thing is just make sure you get even coverage all across them, making sure to try to flip them back over if you accidentally spray them onto their other side. Then after a while, come back, flip them over after they've dried, and then spray the other side, just to make sure everything's nice and evenly coated with that primer, so that way it'll be a lot easier to paint and you won't have any places where the paint does not want to stick to later. So now that we have the model all the way primed and ready to go, we want to start thinking about what areas we want to approach first. So typically I try to go with the places that are the most recessed first, so that way later when we're applying paint, we don't have to try to very gently reach in places and not get paint on other parts. Start there and we can always layer over it later. I've decided here to start with the brown for the legs and the pants, like I said, because it is the most recessed in the model, so that way it'll be the easiest to paint now, and that way I can just worry about not painting over it later with the higher, more raised areas on this model. And I'm going to be following a very similar process for the rest of it.
Also, it just looks straight up like poop. It looks like poop.
It does look like poop. It doesn't help that the water also kind of looks like poop next to it, but...
It looks like poop. It looks like poop.
And while you're doing this step, make sure to try to be as thorough as possible now, and don't worry about getting it on the rest of the model. Like I said, we're going to be coming back with other colors that'll be able to paint over it. Next, we're going to move on to worm green. So I'm going to be using this for the majority of the skin on the model. So that's my chosen color for all of the orc skin. So as you see here, I've made the common mistake of forgetting to fully clean out the brush, and there was a little bit of brown in it. But not to worry, all you have to do, clean out the brush fully, make sure that it's not leaving any more color, and just come back in, mix it together. Worst case scenario, you have a little bit of modeling on the color, and that'll actually look kind of nice. It'll look like it'll give it some interesting, it'll actually give it some interesting skin texture, so nothing to worry about. Same thing goes for the head of Ghazghkull here. Again, don't worry about trying to be very, very gentle and not get it on the little eyepiece or on the teeth. Just throw the paint on there. It's okay. We'll come back later. And we're going to do the same thing for the little grot guy here holding the flag. Just making sure to get it everywhere where any skin's showing, so that way we have it nice and even. And I know usually I try to do thin coats with paint just to make sure that we can build up a layer later. However, sometimes I like to actually kind of leave it thin and inconsistent, especially for things like skin, because then that way you can give it a more realistic look. Because if you look at your own skin, it's not an even color. It's kind of blends and shows different colors depending on where that area of skin's at. So it just kind of makes it seem a little bit more realistic. I'm then going to take Steel Legion Drab and Trader Green and mix them together in equal parts. Once those are mixed together, I'm going to mix in another equal part of Warpstone Green into the mix to get a somewhat darker olive drab color, and that's what I'm going to use to paint the armor. Sometimes when you're holding the pieces, as you might imagine, you can't really paint where your fingers are, and that's okay. Just go ahead and make sure you try to even it out so you don't have rough edges of paint or paint drips or anything like that, and then just set it aside, let it dry. You can always come back to it later. So now that it's gone ahead and dried for a little bit, we'll come back and get that area that we were holding previously and make sure that gets a nice even coverage of paint, and it'll be like it was never missed in the first place. The next color we're going to move on to is Lead Belcher, so we're going to apply that to all the different metally bits, especially the big giant engine on the back. And I left my paint overnight and it separated. Good news is, we shouldn't need to use those, so we're just going to turn this around and we're going to use the nice clear spot. If we look really closely at this backpack here, which is really kind of the engine that's driving the mech armor that Ghazghkull's in, there's a lot of different things going on. We have some shrouds, we've got some gas tanks on the bottom, we've got some different cables on the side, so there's probably going to be a bunch of different colors, but I'm going to start by painting everything that nice kind of lead belchery color, and we'll add colors from there. We're also going to do the same thing on the gun on Ghazghkull's arm, just to make sure that it also has that nice metallic look to it. So, something you might notice here is we've actually already painted this, but we're going to come back and we're actually painting it Lead Belcher now. What I want to show here is it's totally okay to change your mind. I thought it would be fine, and then I realized it might get kind of plain if we don't, so I'm just going to change the color. While we're on this color, we're also going to paint the base panels on our terrain that Ghazghkull's going to be standing on, and the flag that the Grot's holding. We also need to paint all the little claws, hydraulics, and other metallic bits on the rest of the armor, and of course the little cybernetics on Ghazghkull's face. Now we're going to be switching over to a white of your choice. Really, kind of anything will work. I mean, you can even go with a tan if you'd like, but I like starting with white and then using the wash to actually make it more of that tan color. So using that, I'm going to use the white to color all of the skull that's on top of the armor. Then I'm going to be switching over to Kador Red, however you pronounce it. And we're going to use that to paint all of the cloths and banners that are on the model, including his, I guess, loincloth, or whatever you consider that, and then the little flags coming off the Grot banner. Now, as we start to build colors next to each other, we want to be careful not to get the paint on the other colors, but we do want to still be able to move quickly, so don't be afraid. If you make a mistake, you can always come back with the other color and cover it up. We're also going to do the same thing on the little wires coming off the backpack and on the armor. And again, here, patience is a virtue. Just get the paint, and what you're really trying to do is paint with really just like the little blob of paint at the end of it.
You mean just the tip?
And perhaps the hardest part of all, again, using just the little bit of paint at the end of the brush, gently, little eye on Ghazghkull. Oh, yeah, and I suppose we should probably paint the Space Marine helmet. I mean, they don't always have to be the center of attention, so we can leave them for last on this one. We're then going to move on to Thousand Suns Blue. We're going to use that for the little cutouts in the kind of stripped fraying wires that are going to be attached to his armor, just for some color variety. Then we're going to use Cygnus Yellow for a similar thing on any of the remaining wires that we feel like need to be painted. It's up to you. You don't have to, but I like having a little bit of variety. Next, we're going to move on to Skull Crusher Brass. Now, of course, we have to paint all the little bullets that are coming flying out of the minigun on Ghazghkull's arm. So, very gently paint all those. Similar thing, try to use a brush that, is good, but maybe not your highest, most expensive brush, because then, it might ruin it over time, start to get some of those metal flakes on it. And being very careful not to get it on the rest of the lead belcher. Color all the little casings inside the gun itself. We also want to make sure we get one of Ghazghkull's gold metal teeth here. And the little dangly bits on the flag. Now we're going to go back to our Trader Green. We're going to use that by itself to paint the little Imperial Guard helmet that the Grot is standing on. Now we're going to use a Shabti Bone for all of the horn elements, as well as the skulls on Ghazghkull, both his armor and the horns attached to him. And we're also going to do that for our little Grot's horned Viking helmet here. We're going to use Hashut Copper for the fuel tanks and the shrouds on the, mufflers, exhaust ports, whatever you consider those. There we go. Looking nice. We're going to use Abaddon Black to cover the outsides of the wires, so the cables themselves. And we're going to repeat this for each of the cables that we have, as well as the Grot's little boots. Now, as we start to get towards the end of things, we're really going to start focusing on some of the smaller details. So, as you can see, there's all these really small, stitches on Ghazghkull himself, as well as his pants and a few other locations. So what we're doing is that same technique by using the paint blob itself as opposed to the brush. Going to be very delicately just grazing the stitches to get the paint on them. We're also going to get the belt that's just barely showing here. And then we're going to move on to Dawnstone. And we're going to use that to color all of the concrete elements on the base. Now, one thing I've been doing for the horns is to try to get this almost like burnt gradient. Not sure why I've started doing it, I just kind of like the look. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and start dry brushing on a lighter gray. So something like, your Dawnstone color. And we're going to do about maybe 3/4 of the way down and work all the way to the end of the horn. And then we're going to add just a little bit of black to that Dawnstone, so that way it becomes just a little bit darker, and then starting just a little bit further up than we did before, repeat. And then finally what we're going to do is come back with almost entirely black and do just the very end of the horn. So then it almost has this singed or charred, carbony, kind of burnt look to it. I kind of like the way it looks. We're going to go with our Xandri dust, and this one where I'm really just very liberally applying to the entire base of the model. I'm going to come back and cover it with sand later for basing material, so I just want to make sure that anywhere that I don't cover with sand has adequate paint coverage. So, now that everything has its base coat ready, we should be ready to start assembling the model just a little bit more. Super glue time. So once again, being very careful to just get it on the locations that are going to touch each other. Go ahead and start getting everything glued together. There we go. Looking good. Look at that. We're getting somewhere. Get the arms put together. Now, something you might notice here is when we go to apply a wash, we're going to have a similar problem in that we won't be able to reach some of the areas. I'm going to leave off the arms for now to make sure I can actually reach everything. So, as I started looking at this, right before I was ready to apply the wash, I noticed that it was kind of looking a little washed out and like a little too the same color, right? I was kind of losing Ghazghkull in the rest of his armor, right? Because he's green, his armor's green. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take some of the pieces and I'm actually going to go ahead and paint them with lead belcher to make it stand out just a little bit more, as well as the little icon I'm going to make brass. So there we go. So now that you've seen a little bit of a change, now he should be highlighted a little bit more and stand out a bit from his armor, and it should make him look a little bit better. We're going to just glue in his head here, make sure he doesn't go sliding around too much. And his bottom jaw. There we go. Much better. See, now he stands out from the rest of his armor, and it actually kind of highlights his face and draws attention to it. Like I said, you can always change your mind. It's never too late. So now that we have all the different pieces put together here, we're going to be using a series of washes, depending on where we use them, to make sure everything has a nice kind of shadowy look to it. We're going to start with our Beal Tan Green for all of the skin bits, making sure to apply it very liberally to make sure we get adequate coverage and that we have enough of the wash on it to actually sink into the creases and darken them and make it give us that contrast we're looking for. Now, when we're painting this, we also have to be careful, especially with this green color, not to get it on places we don't want the wash to be because it will slightly stain the material. Then we're going to move on to Drakenhof Nightshade for all the blue wires, both the large cables and the little wires coming off his legs. Then we're going to move on to Seraphim Sepia, and this one we're going to be a lot more liberal on where we apply it. It's going to coat pretty much every single metal piece on the model. The reason I'm doing this, especially for orcs, I like to think of it as like everything's very oily, and because of that it gives it that kind of oily sheen to it, like it's kind of been soaked in motor oil, and then I'm going to come back later and cover it with black to give it more of a contrast. This particular wash will end up drying very matte, it doesn't have the gloss addendum to it. So because of that, it can seem a little flat later if I don't come back and highlight it with a little bit of that Nuln Oil. We're also going to make sure to get all the little skull bits, including the adornment skull that'll be on top of Ghazghkull. Once again, just like with the green, try to be somewhat careful in where you get this shade as it will tint the model. We'll make sure we get his jaw and his little leg servos. And while we have it, we're also going to cover some of the reds as well, because it'll be a good accent and help them stand out. We're also going to make sure we get the base covered with it. That way everything stands out a little bit, and when we glue sand onto it later, it'll have some definition underneath. Also, we're going to get the horns, banner, handle, and shorts for our little guy here to make sure they all get a nice even coating of the Seraphim Sepia. We're also going to do a similar treatment to the red cloth hanging down from Ghazgkull's waist. Now that we're done with that, we're actually going to move on to the Nuln Oil, and for this one I chose the non-gloss version, so just Nuln Oil, not that's a fun word to try to say, Nuln Oil Gloss, because we don't want it to be shiny when we're done with it. If you do want yours to be shiny, go right ahead and use the gloss version, but I prefer the matte. We're going to make sure we cover all of the areas we previously hit with the Seraphim Sepia, as well as the armor in general. Same thing for all of the areas we just hit on the grot, including the standard, the flags, his shorts, the tassel, the base helmet, and most everything else. We're also going to make sure to apply this all over Ghazgkull's main torso section as well. So now that everything has its wash put on it, it's ready to glue together. Now, you could stop at this point, looks great, or if you want, you can take it one step further by going back and actually doing some dry brushing and a little bit of highlighting. So to do this, we're going to take all of the paints that we've previously used and add just a little bit of white to them, and we're going to create a little bit of a palette, so that way we have our midtones and some highlights to use, and come back over the areas we just painted, paying attention to just try to paint just the most raised areas, just to give it that extra little bit of definition. So we're going to start with our green, and we're going to mix in a little bit of white here, and we're going to try to go from a dark green to a medium green to our lighter green on the right. And we're going to use this to try to touch up the different areas. So using the medium, we're going to come back and just gently get the most raised bits of the muscles on the grot, as well as the upper portion of his back. Now for the reds, we're actually going to use both red and orange to do this. The first step is to take the lighter red and come back and highlight the outermost edges of the flags and banners. We're also going to repeat this on Ghazghkull's belt cloth. Now we're going to take that orangey color and we're going to come back and, even more restrained than before, just barely highlight just a few key areas with it. Just getting just the edges of places. So that way it'll seem like it's an even brighter red and even catching more of the sun. Now, being very, very, very careful, using just a tiny bit of paint, we're going to put just a little dot on the glass to make it look like it's shiny. Now now we're going to get our tan out and paint Ghazghkull's glorious teeth. We're also going to take the Dawnstone and try to highlight just the edges of the Grot's boots. Now, one of my favorite parts of the highlighting and dry brushing step is dry brushing all of the scuffed silver or scuffed metal look onto the model. Also mainly because I don't have to be that precise with it and I just kind of get to go wild with it. So once we prepare our brush, make sure we get most of the paint out but just a little bit left. We're going to take it and going at kind of an odd angle, kind of an off angle. We don't want to be stabbing it and we don't want to be brushing it on, but we just want to be just barely kind of scratching the surface with the brush just to give a very hint of metal scratches to it. We're also going to do that on his armor as well because it is metallic, so we're going to make sure that it looks like, you know, he's gone through some battle damage, scraped it up against stuff, you know, that kind of thing. Now it's also important to make sure you get it everywhere because we want it to look like the whole of the model has gone through some sort of battle and been scratched and scraped and beat up, and the whole idea is he's supposed to be some battle damaged mech suit, right? So don't worry about it. Go wild. Now, it may take a few coats, but we're also going to paint the base that used to be black, but is now spray painted white, and we're just going to paint it back to black again, or whatever color you want. Now we're going to move on to the basing step, where we're actually going to take some decorative filler, or in this case, really, it's a bottle of sand, and we're going to put it on the base using super glue. Liberally apply the super glue to the base, being careful not to touch it as best you can. And if you want, you could also use PVA glue for this. I prefer super glue, but to each their own. Then take your model with all the super glue on it and put it in a container of this little sand here and just start throwing it all over the place. Once you think you got enough, gently tap it off and see how it looks. If you need more sand, put more on. If you think you're good, you're all done. Now, one thing you do want to be kind of careful of is it's a bit, it's a bit messy. As you can see, the big guy didn't really fit in the container here, so I really started to have just dropping the sand all over the base, and it kind of got everywhere. There we go. Look at that. So now they've got a base full of sand. Looks like they're actually on some nice terrain. Got them all dry brushed up, highlighted, and that's really just about it. All done. I'm actually pretty pleased with how these came out. I haven't really done too many really big models before, and I think they look pretty good. Hopefully this tutorial's been helpful for you if you're approaching a larger model for the first time. It can be very intimidating. I know for me, like I said, I really haven't made too many large-scale Warhammer models, and just taking it step by step can be very helpful in approaching something like this. And if you make mistakes, that's okay. You can always come back, you can repaint it. Even if you had to completely redo an area, that's okay. It's all about having fun. You really don't have to get too concerned about it. Just take your time, enjoy the process, and have fun. Thanks for watching.